Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very calm, very slow, and very unresolved. So dim the lights, put your phone face down, maybe lower the volume just a little more than feels reasonable, and get comfortable. Because tonight we begin with a civilization that showed up early, did everything suspiciously well, and then quietly vanished without leaving a forwarding address. This is the Indus Valley Civilization, and honestly, it's kind of the king of historical ghosting. Now, when most people think of ancient civilizations, they think of loud personalities. You've got Egypt with its pyramids screaming, "Look at me," across the desert. You've got Mesopotamia inventing writing and laws, and generally being very proud of itself. And then you've got the Indus Valley, sitting there around 2600 BCE, building perfectly planned cities, refusing to carve their kings' faces into mountains, and absolutely declining to explain themselves to future historians. Of course they did. The Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan Civilization, lived in what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. This was not a small operation. At its peak, it covered over 1 million square kilometers. That's bigger than ancient Egypt. And yet, somehow, it managed to stay emotionally distant. Their major cities were Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and right away, historians noticed something unsettling. These cities were tidy, like suspiciously tidy. Straight streets, grid layouts, standardized breaks, actual drainage systems, private bathrooms. Private bathrooms in 2600 BCE. Meanwhile, other civilizations were still figuring out how not to throw things directly into the street. The Indus Valley said, "No thank you, we'll be installing covered sewage channels now." And this is where the mystery starts to gently hum in the background, like a ceiling fan you can't quite turn off. Because cities like Mohenjo-daro weren't just functional, they were consistent, almost eerily consistent. The bricks were the same size across hundreds of miles. The weights and measures were standardized. The streets followed the same patterns, which strongly suggests central planning. But here's the problem. We can't find the planners. No giant palaces, no royal tombs, no statues yelling, "I am king and this city is about me." Instead, what we get are baked bricks, modest houses, and a civilization that appears to have collectively agreed to not make a big deal out of leadership, which is weird. Most ancient civilizations loved hierarchy. They adored it. Kings, priests, god kings, divine emperors. The Indus Valley just kind of shrugged and built a really good sewer. Now, let's talk about Mohenjo-daro for a moment, because it's the most famous of these cities and also the most frustrating. Its name means Mound of the Dead, which is dramatic but misleading. Because when archaeologists arrived, they didn't find mass graves or apocalyptic destruction. They found abandoned buildings, collapsed walls, dust, which again is rude. Mohenjo-daro had a citadel area, slightly raised above the rest of the city, but even there, no obvious palace. Instead, the most famous structure is the Great Bath. The Great Bath is exactly what it sounds like, a large, carefully sealed pool lined with bitumen, with steps leading down into it. And no one knows why it exists. Was it religious? Ceremonial? A community spa day? A very early attempt at wellness culture? We don't know. They didn't write it down. Of course they didn't. Which brings us to the writing, or more accurately, the unreadable scribbles that haunt museum placards everywhere. The Indus Valley Civilization did have writing. We know this because they left behind seals with symbols on them, short inscriptions, usually 5 to 10 characters long, and we cannot read a single one. Not one. There is no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription, no helpful footnote carved into a wall. So historians stare at these symbols, nod thoughtfully, and say things like, "This appears to represent something." Some scholars think it's a logo system. Others think it's a full script. Others think it's not even writing, just symbols. Everyone is tired. And yet, these seals are everywhere, carved from steatite, often featuring animals. Which animals? Unicorns. Well, a sort of unicorn. It's usually a one-horned creature that looks like a cow who's committed to minimalism. Is it mythical? Is it symbolic? Is it just a cow drawn from the side and we're overthinking it? Again, they didn't explain. Now, if you're expecting kings with tragic childhoods and questionable marriages, don't worry, we'll get there eventually. But the Indus Valley does something even more unsettling. They don't give us individuals. No names, no dynasties, no royal gossip. It's like an entire civilization decided, collectively, that personal branding was cringe. The houses in Mohenjo-daro vary in size, but not dramatically. There's no Versailles situation happening here. Even the largest homes are reasonable. Some have courtyards, some have wells, many have toilets. Everyone gets a toilet. That's the vibe. This has led some historians to suggest the Indus Valley was unusually egalitarian, or at least less aggressively hierarchical than its neighbors, which is fascinating and also inconvenient because it leaves us nothing juicy to gossip about. Instead of tyrants and scandals, we get standardized bricks and civic responsibility. Riveting, but also calming. Let's float gently over to daily life. The Indus people farmed wheat and barley. They domesticated animals. They traded extensively. We know this because Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamia, which means they were out there doing international business while staying deeply private. They exported beads, pottery, maybe cotton. Yes, very early cotton. And while Mesopotamian scribes were busy recording how many goats belonged to whom, the Indus Valley just shipped goods and went home. Now, religion. This is where things get speculative in a very sleepy way. We don't have temples, at least not obvious ones, but we do have figurines. Some depict animals, some depict women, possibly fertility figures, some depict a seated figure, cross-legged, surrounded by animals. This figure is often called the Proto-Shiva. Is it actually Shiva? We don't know. Is it a yogi? A god? A doodle? Historians argue politely and then go lie down. There's also a noticeable absence of weapons in Indus Valley sites, which doesn't mean they were peaceful saints. It just means they didn't obsessively carve swords into everything. They seemed more interested in craft, beads, jewelry, carefully drilled stones, which suggests a culture that valued precision, patience, routine. A civilization of people who would have loved spreadsheets. And then, around 1900 BCE, things start to drift. Cities begin to thin out, construction quality declines, standardization loosens, bricks get sloppy, which is how archaeologists know something is wrong. There's no single catastrophic event, no burning layer, no burning city, just fading. Possible reasons include climate change, the Indus River may have shifted, monsoons may have weakened, agriculture becomes harder, trade slows, and slowly people leave. Not all at once, no dramatic exit, just families moving away, houses left empty, cities quietly exhaling their last breath. And that's what makes the Indus Valley Civilization so strangely intimate. It doesn't end with screams or conquest. It ends with silence, which is fitting, because silence is kind of their whole thing. All right, settle back in. Adjust the pillow. We're still drifting along the Indus River, and nothing is about to dramatically happen. which, honestly, is very on brand. Last time, we left our extremely competent yet emotionally unavailable civilization gently fading into obscurity. Tonight, we're going to poke at one of the most irritating questions historians ask themselves at 3 in the morning. Who was in charge here? Because something clearly was. You don't accidentally build dozens of large cities with matching layouts, identical bricks, standardized weights, and citywide drainage systems. That requires planning, organization, meetings, probably very boring meetings. But when archaeologists went looking for kings, queens, emperors, or at least someone who looked vaguely important, they found almost nothing. No crowns, no thrones, no royal tombs filled with dramatic afterlife accessories. Just people and bricks. So many bricks. In Mesopotamia, kings loved to leave receipts. I built this. I conquered that. I am chosen by the gods. Deal with it. The Indus Valley did none of this, which suggests either a deeply restrained ruling class or none at all. Some historians think the Indus cities were run by councils, groups of elders, merchants, priests, possibly the most powerful homeowners association in ancient history. Imagine it, a room full of calm, serious people debating sewage gradients. And if that sounds dull, it probably was. But it worked. Now, there are a few structures that stand out slightly. The citadels, for example, raised platforms at the edge of cities, likely used for public or administrative purposes. But even these are modest, functional, no giant statues looming over the population, which is deeply suspicious, because if you're powerful, why not flex? Unless power here didn't look like power elsewhere. Maybe authority was quiet, procedural, based on tradition and compliance rather than divine threat. Or maybe leadership rotated. Or maybe we're just projecting modern ideas onto a very ancient group of people who refused to clarify anything. Now let's drift gently into social structure. Most Indus Valley homes were made of baked brick. They had multiple rooms. Some had upper floors. They weren't shacks. They weren't palaces. They were fine, which suggests a relatively comfortable urban population. Not equal exactly, but not wildly unequal either. There's no neighborhood screaming, "rich people only," no slums screaming, "we've been forgotten." Everyone had access to water. Everyone had drainage. And this is where historians start using words like remarkable and unusual, which is academic code for "this is messing up my assumptions." Because inequality is usually loud in the archaeological record, and here it's oddly muted. Now, before we get too utopian, let's be clear. This wasn't some ancient socialist paradise. People still worked. Some jobs were better than others. Someone cleaned those drains. But the absence of extreme wealth display suggests social norms that discouraged excess. Or, again, maybe the elites existed but were extremely shy. Which brings us back to religion, or whatever passed for it. We talked about the Great Bath earlier, and it's still sitting there, quietly judging us. Most scholars agree it was ceremonial, probably used for ritual purification. Water mattered a lot to these people. Not surprising, given they lived along rivers that could give life or completely ruin it. But beyond that, the religious landscape gets fuzzy. We have seals showing animals, trees, that seated figure again, possibly meditating. Some see early Hindu elements here. Others warn against retrofitting later religions onto earlier cultures, which is fair. The Indus Valley didn't leave us hymns or myths, no creation stories, no gods introducing themselves, just symbols and figurines. And those figurines deserve a moment. Many are female, exaggerated hips, prominent features, often labeled mother goddess figures, but that label is doing a lot of work. They could be fertility symbols, they could be toys, they could be folk art. We don't know, which is exhausting. Now let's talk about children. Because yes, there were children here. They existed. They grew up in these neat little cities. We know this from toys, tiny carts, little animal figures with wheels. And suddenly, the Indus Valley feels less like a mystery and more like a place where someone's kid lost their favorite toy 4,000 years ago, which is grounding. Education is another big question mark. Writing existed, but it's short and repetitive. No long texts, no tablets explaining math or philosophy. This suggests that literacy, if it existed, was limited, perhaps used only for trade or identification, which means knowledge was probably passed down orally, skills learned through apprenticeship, traditions maintained quietly. Again, no drama. Trade, however, was anything but small. The Indus Valley traded with Mesopotamia, Oman, maybe Central Asia. We know this because Mesopotamian texts mentioned a place called Meluha, widely believed to be the Indus region. They describe Meluhan traders arriving with exotic goods, carnelian beads, ivory, cotton, and sometimes interpreters, which suggests language barriers, meaning the Indus people spoke something entirely lost to us, another silence. Now here's where things get gently unsettling. Despite all this organization, trade, and infrastructure, we don't see much evidence of warfare. No city walls designed for defense, no mass graves from battles, no glorified weapons. That doesn't mean they were pacifists, it just means conflict wasn't their personality, which raises an uncomfortable question. If they weren't constantly fighting, conquering, or shouting about their gods, what held them together? The answer may be cultural cohesion, shared norms, shared practices, shared standards, the same bricks, the same layouts, the same systems. A civilization that agreed collectively on how things should be done, which is powerful and fragile, because when that agreement starts to fray, everything does. Around 2000 BCE, subtle changes appear. Pottery styles shift, urban planning becomes less precise, people begin moving eastward, cities shrink, and no one leaves a note saying why. Climate is the leading suspect. The Indus River system was fed by glaciers and monsoons. If those patterns changed, agriculture would suffer. Some rivers may have dried up, others changed course. Fields failed, food security weakened, and when the system stops working, people adapt. They don't riot, they relocate, which is what we see. Smaller settlements, more rural life, less emphasis on urban planning. It's not collapse in the Hollywood sense. It's decentralization, a quiet letting go. And here's the part that keeps historians awake. This civilization lasted for over 700 years. That's longer than the Roman Republic, longer than many dynasties. And it did so without leaving us kings, chronicles, or clear religious texts. Which means history, as we usually write it, doesn't know what to do with them. No villains, no heroes, just people who showed up early, built well, lived calmly, and left without making a scene. In the next part, we'll wander through the theories, the invasions that probably didn't happen, the myths that grew later, and how modern nationalism sometimes tries to claim a civilization that refuses to be claimed. So keep resting, Let the unanswered questions drift by. The Indus Valley isn't going to resolve itself tonight, and honestly, it never does. All right, let's sink a little deeper into the mattress. The lights are low, the Indus River is still flowing, or maybe it isn't. No one wrote it down. In this part, we're going to do what humans always do when faced with silence. We're going to speculate. Gently, tiredly, sometimes badly. Because when a civilization refuses to explain itself, later civilizations tend to step in and do the explaining for them, whether they asked for it or not. So let's start with the most famous explanation for the end of the Indus Valley Civilization, the invasion theory. This one used to be very popular, almost suspiciously popular. The idea goes like this. Around 1500 BCE, Indo-Aryan groups migrate into the subcontinent. They bring horses, chariots, and a language that eventually becomes Sanskrit. They conquer the Indus cities. Everything collapses. The end. Simple, clean, dramatic, and probably wrong, because archaeology is very rude to neat stories. There's no widespread evidence of violent destruction, no burned layers across cities, no piles of bodies screaming, "We were conquered." Mohenjo-daro famously was once described as having skeletons lying in the streets, victims of sudden slaughter. Turns out that was an exaggeration. The skeletons were from different time periods. Some were burials, some were just bones, which is awkward. So the invasion theory quietly lost credibility, not completely abandoned, but downgraded. Now it's more like migration rather than invasion. People moved, cultures mixed, languages shifted. Less swords, more slow blending, which again fits the Indus Valley's entire vibe. They don't go out in a blaze of glory, they just transition. But humans love drama, so we keep trying to spice it up. Another theory blames environmental collapse, and this one is actually pretty compelling. The Indus Valley depended on a complex river system, not just the Indus itself, but also rivers like the Ghaggar Hakra. This river may have once been mighty, fed by glaciers, reliable, and then it wasn't. Climate data suggest monsoon patterns shifted around this time. Rainfall decreased, rivers dried or changed course, which is devastating for agriculture. Imagine planning your entire civilization around water, and then the water quietly leaves. No war needed, no invasion, just hunger, uncertainty, migration. People move east toward more reliable rainfall. Cities empty slowly. And because this happens over generations, no one writes, "This is the end." It just happens. There's also the possibility of earthquakes. Tectonic shifts can alter river paths dramatically, and the Indus region is not exactly geologically chill. So maybe the land itself changed. The ground moved, the rivers followed, and the cities, perfectly planned for a world that no longer existed, were left behind, which is a very soft apocalypse. Now let's talk about something slightly uncomfortable: modern identity. Because the Indus Valley Civilization didn't disappear into nothingness. Its people didn't evaporate. They became later people. But which ones? This is where modern politics sometimes tiptoe into ancient history and make everything tense. Some groups want to claim the Indus Valley as their direct ancestors. Others argue for continuity. Others emphasize rupture. And the problem is, the evidence doesn't give us clean answers. There are cultural continuities, certain symbols, agricultural practices, urban traditions. But there are also changes. Languages shift, religious practices evolve. So instead of a single lineage, we probably have blending, which is boring and therefore accurate. Now let's drift back to daily life one last time. Because for all the big theories, The Indus Valley was made of people doing very small things: waking up, fetching water, cooking food, children playing with clay carts, craftspeople drilling beads with astonishing precision, merchants weighing goods with standardized stone weights. Imagine the quiet pride of someone knowing their brick was the correct ratio every time. This civilization cared deeply about order, not flashy order, not authoritarian order, just things being done properly. And when that order stopped being sustainable, they didn't cling to it out of ego. They adapted, which is oddly mature for ancient history. Now let's revisit the writing one last time, because it still hasn't forgiven us. There are about 400 to 450 distinct signs in the Indus script. That's too many for a simple alphabet, too few for a full logographic system like Chinese. It sits in an annoying middle ground. Some researchers think it encodes language, others think it's symbolic. Computer analyses have been done, patterns studied, and still nothing. No names, no sentences, just seals that once identified people or goods, now identifying our ignorance. And here's the thing. Even if we cracked the script tomorrow, it might not give us what we want, because these inscriptions are short. They're probably labels, ownership marks, trade identifiers, not diaries, not royal gossip, not "today the king was unbearable." So the Indus Valley may always remain emotionally distant, which is oddly fitting. They didn't build monuments to be remembered. They built systems to function, and systems don't care if you remember them. Now, before we end this part, let's talk about the one thing that always sneaks into discussions like this: the idea that maybe, just maybe, we're missing something huge. What if leadership existed but looked nothing like later kings? What if power was distributed in ways archaeology struggles to detect? What if their values were so different that our questions don't even apply? We keep asking, who ruled? Maybe the better question is, why didn't anyone feel the need to tell us? And that's uncomfortable, because history is usually written by people who want attention. The Indus Valley didn't. They left behind infrastructure, not propaganda, public works, not propaganda, which is deeply ironic because it makes them one of the most intriguing civilizations we know, while also being one of the hardest to narrate. There's no rise and fall, no golden age followed by decadence, just emergence, stability, gradual change, a long, quiet middle. And maybe that's why they're perfect for this channel. No cliffhangers, no shocking betrayals, just the steady hum of human life organized well enough to last centuries and humble enough to fade without complaint. In the next part, we'll gently step back and look at the legacy, how the Indus Valley quietly shaped the subcontinent, how its urban DNA lingered, and why modern archaeology is still slightly obsessed with a civilization that refuses to perform. So stay relaxed. Let the questions remain unanswered. All right, let's keep going. You're still comfortable. Nothing urgent is happening. The Indus Valley is still not explaining itself. By now, this civilization has technically ended, at least in the way textbooks like to draw lines. But history doesn't really do endings, it does echoes. And the Indus Valley left behind a lot of those, quietly humming beneath everything that came after. So, in this part, we're going to talk about legacy. Not the dramatic kind with monuments and anniversaries, the subtle kind that seeps into daily life and then gets completely taken for granted. Let's start with cities. Because urban planning is where the Indus Valley absolutely refuses to be forgotten. Long after Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were abandoned, people in South Asia kept building towns with familiar features: wells in courtyards, careful water management, brick construction. Not identical, but recognizable. It's not that later cultures copied Indus cities directly. It's more that the knowledge didn't vanish. People remembered how to manage water, how to live densely without everything collapsing into chaos. And that matters. Because urban life is fragile. Lose the skills, and cities become very unpleasant very quickly. Now, sanitation. This is the part where historians sigh wistfully. The Indus Valley had covered drains, inspection holes, private toilets connected to public systems. And then, that level of sanitation disappears for a very long time. Centuries later, cities in many parts of the world are doing significantly worse. Which means the Indus Valley wasn't just advanced, it was ahead in a way that didn't stick. Progress is not a straight line. Sometimes it just wanders off. Now let's talk about craft traditions. Bead making, stone drilling, metalwork. The Indus craftspeople were extremely skilled. Their beads are still studied today for their precision. And those techniques didn't vanish overnight. They were passed down, modified, adapted. You don't just forget how to drill stone perfectly. Someone taught someone else, and that someone taught someone else, which means the Indus Valley lived on in hands and habits, not headlines. Now, religion, or at least symbols. This is where things get speculative, but gently so. Certain motifs seen in the Indus Valley reappear later in South Asian traditions. Trees as sacred symbols, animals with symbolic weight, figures in yogic postures. Does that mean direct continuity? Not necessarily. Ideas travel, they evolve. But it does suggest that the Indus Valley contributed threads to a much larger cultural tapestry. Not the whole picture, just threads, which is appropriate. Now let's pause for a moment and talk about archaeology itself, because the Indus Valley wasn't discovered until the 20th century. For thousands of years, its cities were just mounds. Locals sometimes took bricks from them, farmers plowed over ancient streets, and no one knew what they were destroying, which is humbling. The modern world walked over this civilization without noticing. It wasn't until the 1920s that archaeologists realized something enormous was hiding in plain sight. And when they started digging, they were stunned. Not because of gold or treasures, but because of organization. It didn't fit the narrative. At the time, ancient India was often portrayed as receiving civilization from elsewhere. The Indus Valley complicated that. Here was a sophisticated urban culture contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia, developing on its own terms. And that mattered politically. Because archaeology is never just about the past. It's about who gets to claim sophistication, which is why the Indus Valley sometimes gets pulled into modern arguments it never consented to. National pride, cultural ownership, all projected onto a civilization that never carved its name into anything. Now, let's drift into one of the softer mysteries. Why didn't they monumentalize themselves? No pyramids, no ziggurats, no colossal statues. Monuments serve a purpose. They tell future generations, we were here, remember us. The Indus Valley didn't seem interested. Maybe they valued impermanence. Maybe their beliefs didn't emphasize afterlife. Glory? Or maybe they just preferred practical investments. Why build a statue when you can build a drain? And that choice, ironically, made them easier to forget. Because stone monuments survive, mud brick cities fade, which means their humility worked against them. Now let's talk about writing again, briefly, because it refuses to leave us alone. If the script is ever deciphered, it may change everything, or it may change almost nothing. It might reveal names of merchants, trade terms, administrative labels, which would be fascinating, but not emotionally satisfying. No epic poetry is waiting there. This was a civilization that communicated efficiently, not expressively, and that's okay. Now, here's something that often gets overlooked. The Indus Valley lasted longer than most ancient empires. It didn't collapse under its own weight. It didn't burn itself out chasing conquest. It endured. And when conditions changed, it adapted. That's not failure, that's resilience. But because history likes sharp endings, we label it a decline, which feels unfair. If anything, the Indus Valley teaches us that civilizations don't have to explode to end. They can dissolve, and the people continue. Which brings us to the present. Today, Mohenjo-daro is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it is, unfortunately, crumbling. Salt damage, erosion, tourism. The same forces of environment and time that ended the city once are doing it again, which feels poetic and slightly depressing. We're trying to preserve a civilization that never asked to be preserved. Now, before we drift into the next part, let's sit with something. The Indus Valley Civilization challenges our assumptions about what advanced looks like. No kings shouting from thrones, no armies marching in reliefs, just quiet competence. And maybe that's why it's still so hard to categorize. It doesn't fit the story structures we like. No main character, no villain, just systems, people, time. In the next part, we'll slow things down even more. We'll revisit the unanswered questions one last time, not to solve them, but to live with them. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be closed. They're meant to keep us company while we fall asleep. So stay where you are. Nothing needs resolving. The Indus Valley is patient. All right, we're still here, still drifting. Nothing is asking for your attention, and the Indus Valley is perfectly fine with that. By this point in the story, most history channels would be wrapping things up, summarizing, drawing conclusions, tying everything into a neat little bow. But that would feel wrong, because the Indus Valley Civilization does not like neat bows. It prefers loose ends, quiet gaps, long pauses where nothing happens, and that's the point. So in this part, we're not going to solve anything. We're going to sit with the unanswered questions and see how strangely comfortable they can be. Let's start with the biggest one, the question everyone asks first. Why don't we know more? It's tempting to blame archaeology, or lost texts, or bad luck. But the uncomfortable answer is that this civilization didn't prioritize being remembered. They didn't carve their stories into stone. They didn't build monuments designed to outlast them. They didn't scream their values into the landscape. They invested in the present, in clean water, in predictable streets, in standardized bricks. Things that matter deeply while you're alive, and not at all once you're gone. And that's a very different philosophy from most ancient elites. Think about Egypt again. Every pyramid is a demand. Do not forget me. The Indus Valley made no such demand. And because of that, we're left piecing together a life from infrastructure, which is oddly intimate. When you walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-daro, you don't see propaganda. You see kitchens, bathrooms, wells. You see where people stood in line for water, where they washed, where they slept. Not what they wanted you to think about them, what they actually did. Now let's talk about time, because the Indus Valley existed for centuries, long enough for multiple generations to be born, live, and die, without ever knowing they were part of something historians would later argue about. To them, this wasn't a civilization, it was just life. Children grew up assuming drains worked, that streets were straight, that bricks were uniform. And when those things slowly stopped being true, it must have felt strange. Imagine being the generation that noticed things slipping. Bricks not quite the same size, repairs taking longer, trade goods arriving less often. No collapse, just inconvenience. and then adaptation. People moved, changed routines, adjusted expectations. History books call this decline, but lived experience probably felt more like adjustment, which is very human. Now, let's gently return to the people themselves, because it's easy to talk about the Indus Valley as an idea, but it was made of individuals. Someone designed those weights, someone enforced those standards. Someone woke up early to clean a drain. Someone argued about brick ratios. Someone sat by the river and noticed it wasn't behaving the way it used to. We don't know their names, but we know their priorities. And those priorities weren't glory or conquest. They were reliability. Now, this is where modern viewers sometimes get restless. Okay, they say, but where's the drama? And the answer is there isn't much. No mad kings, no cursed dynasties, no royal children doomed by inbreeding, just people quietly being competent, which is frankly revolutionary, because it challenges the idea that civilization requires hierarchy, spectacle, and domination. The Indus Valley suggests another model, one where coordination matters more than charisma, where systems matter more than personalities. And that's unsettling, because it implies that some of the most successful societies may also be the least interesting to storytellers. Now, let's talk about what happens when we try to force a story anyway. Modern retellings sometimes turn the Indus Valley into something it wasn't: a lost golden age, a spiritual utopia, a proto-everything. This happens when silence makes us uncomfortable. We want it to mean something, but maybe it already does. Maybe the meaning is restraint. The Indus Valley shows us that you don't have to monumentalize power for a society to function, that order can exist without spectacle, that decline doesn't have to be catastrophic to be real, and that history doesn't always leave us closure. Now, let's slow things down even more. Imagine the final years of Mohenjo-daro, not the last day, not a dramatic moment, just later years. Some houses abandoned, others still occupied, streets quieter. Maybe a family decides to leave. They pack what they can carry. They don't think of themselves as the last of anything. They're just moving. And somewhere a child leaves behind a toy cart in the dust. And that's it. No final inscription, no farewell speech. The city doesn't know it's being remembered thousands of years later. Now, let's gently consider the script one final time, because it's still there, still unread. And maybe that's okay, because if we ever read it, it won't suddenly make this civilization loud. It won't turn it into Egypt or Mesopotamia. It will still be the Indus Valley, efficient, reserved, unbothered. And maybe it will tell us mundane things, inventory lists, names we don't recognize, and we'll realize that even with language, the distance remains. Because time does that. Now, before we move on to the next part, let's acknowledge something. The Indus Valley Civilization doesn't give us a moral lesson. It doesn't warn us about hubris. It doesn't reward us with triumph. It just exists. And then it doesn't, which is, in its own way, honest. In the next part, we'll let things taper off even further. We'll reflect on why this civilization works so well as a bedtime story, why its quiet persistence and gentle fading mirror the rhythm of sleep itself. No climax, no resolution, just rest. So stay right where you are. The Indus Valley isn't going anywhere, and neither are you. All right. We're nearing that very calm stretch of the night where thoughts loosen their grip a little. Nothing is urgent. Nothing needs to be answered. And the Indus Valley is still doing exactly what it's always done, which is not much. And that's why it works. Because if you think about it, the Indus Valley Civilization is almost engineered for rest. There's no sharp rise, no violent fall, no shouting gods or unstable kings demanding attention. Just a long, even rhythm. Cities appear. They function. They persist. They slowly change. That's it. And that rhythm mirrors sleep more than storytelling. Most historical narratives rely on escalation. This one refuses. And that refusal is kind of soothing. Now let's gently examine why we, thousands of years later, keep coming back to this civilization. Because we do. Archaeologists, historians, late-night YouTube listeners. There's something deeply calming about competence without ego. The Indus Valley doesn't posture. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't try to impress us. It just works. And in a world where so much history is about domination, collapse, and excess, that's quietly radical. Think about how rare it is to encounter a society that doesn't seem obsessed with being remembered. Most elites claw at immortality. The Indus Valley shrugged and installed better drainage, which tells us something important. They were focused on quality of life, not legacy. And that's oddly modern. Now let's slow things down even further and talk about repetition, because repetition is everywhere in the Indus Valley. Same brick ratios, same city layouts, same weight systems. Repetition creates predictability. Predictability creates calm. This civilization was built on predictability, which means living there probably felt stable. You knew where the streets went. You knew how water flowed. You knew how goods were measured. There's comfort in that. And when those systems began to fray, the response wasn't panic. It was adjustment. Move east, change scale, let go of cities that no longer make sense, which suggests emotional restraints on a cultural level, not clinging, not raging, just moving on. Now let's talk about how rare that is in the archaeological record. Most civilizations end loudly. They leave layers of ash, broken statues, propaganda blaming someone else. The Indus Valley leaves absence, and absence forces us to slow down. There's nothing to chase, no final battle to analyze, just gaps. And gaps are restful. Now imagine being an archaeologist at Mohenjo-daro. You uncover a street. It's straight, cleanly planned. You uncover a house. It has a bathroom. You uncover another house, also a bathroom, and another. At first, it's exciting. Then, it's just consistent, which is where the tone of Indus Valley research shifts from excitement to quiet respect. There's no shock value, just sustained quality. And that kind of quality doesn't demand attention, it invites it. Now let's talk about the absence of spectacle again, because it really matters. No massive temples, no giant statues, which means religious life, if present, was likely intimate. Rituals at home, community practices, nothing designed to overwhelm, which suggests a worldview that didn't require fear to function. No looming gods carved into stone, just symbols, animals, water. And water is gentle until it isn't, which brings us back, softly, to the environment. The Indus Valley rose because of rivers, and it changed because of rivers. Not suddenly, not violently, gradually, which is how nature usually works. We like disasters with dates. Nature prefers long transitions. And the Indus Valley lived long enough to experience that truth. Now let's drift into something a little more abstract, the idea of anonymity. Most civilizations are obsessed with names: who ruled, who conquered, who built. The Indus Valley didn't preserve names, which means individuals dissolved into the collective, not erased, just not highlighted. And that's unsettling for modern minds. We want protagonists. The Indus Valley gives us systems, and systems are harder to emotionally attach to. But they're also more honest, because most of human history is lived inside systems, not stories. Now, consider this. What if the Indus Valley didn't think of itself as exceptional? What if they didn't know they were early? What if they didn't feel innovative? They were just solving problems in front of them. Clean water, clean waste removal, trade logistics. No grand narrative, just daily competence. And maybe that's why there's no mythology carved into stone. They didn't need one. Now, as we let this part wind down, let's acknowledge why this civilization keeps resurfacing in quiet moments. It represents an alternative path, a reminder that complexity doesn't require cruelty, that order doesn't require spectacle, that longevity doesn't require obsession with immortality, and that fading doesn't have to be failure, which is a deeply restful idea. Because it means things can end without being ruined. They can simply stop being needed. Now, in the final part, we'll let everything settle. No new theories, no new questions. Just a gentle closing drift back along the river, past the empty streets, toward sleep. So, stay comfortable. The Indus Valley has said everything it's going to say, and that's enough. All right, this is the part where nothing new really happens, which is perfect. If you're still listening, you're doing exactly what this civilization seems to prefer, being present but not demanding resolution. So let's take one last, very slow walk back through the Indus Valley. Not as archaeologists, not as historians, just as quiet observers, moving at the speed of night. Imagine the river first, wide, unhurried, sometimes generous, sometimes unreliable. The Indus doesn't rush, it doesn't denounce itself, it simply moves, shaping land over centuries instead of moments. And around it, long ago, people learned how to live with that rhythm. They didn't try to dominate it. They planned around it. They built cities that assumed water mattered, that waste mattered, that predictability mattered. And they trusted those systems enough to repeat them again and again. Same bricks, same layouts, same quiet confidence. Now, picture Mohenjo-daro at its calmest. Not at its height, not at its end. Just a normal day. The streets are clean. The drains are working. Someone opens a door to a courtyard and lowers a bucket into a well. Somewhere nearby, a craftsperson drills a bead, slowly, patiently. A child pulls a small toy cart across the ground, the wheels clicking softly. Nothing remarkable is happening. And that's the point. This civilization didn't organize itself around moments of greatness. It organized itself around ordinary days that didn't fall apart. And those days added up to centuries. Now, let's gently acknowledge something that's easy to miss. The Indus Valley wasn't fragile. It didn't vanish because it was weak. It changed because the conditions that supported it changed. And when the balance tipped, when rivers shifted, when rainfall patterns altered, the people didn't cling to cities out of stubbornness or pride. They adapted. They scaled down. They moved, which is honestly one of the healthiest endings a civilization can have. No obsession with permanence, no denial, just acceptance. And acceptance is quiet. Now, think about how little we know of their inner lives. What did they worry about? Probably harvests, water levels, family health. What did they celebrate? Seasonal cycles, successful trade, community rituals. What did they fear? Floods, droughts, uncertainty. Not so different from anyone else, really. And that familiarity is comforting, because it reminds us that most people in history weren't dramatic. They were practical. They wanted things to work. And when things stopped working, they adjusted. Now, as the cities slowly thinned out, there was no moment where someone declared, "This civilization is over." No ceremony. Just fewer lights in the evening, more empty houses, streets still there, but quieter. Eventually, grass growing between bricks, and then time. Wind, rain, silt. The river doing what rivers do, and the cities becoming mounds. For thousands of years, the world walked over them without knowing what they were. And that feels fitting, because the Indus Valley never asked to be remembered. It didn't build itself for the future. It built itself for the present. And once the present changed, it let go. Now, think about how that contrasts with us. We document everything. We archive, we announce. We're terrified of being forgotten. The Indus Valley wasn't. And there's something deeply restful about that difference. Now let's talk about why this story doesn't really end. Even now, archaeologists are still digging, still measuring bricks, still debating symbols, still trying to coax meaning out of silence. And the silence remains polite, but firm, which teaches us something important. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved quickly. Some exist to slow us down, to remind us that not every society is loud, not every ending is catastrophic, not every story has a climax. Some stories are just steady, and then they fade, and the fading is gentle. As we come to the very end of this part, let's return to where we started. You, lying there, listening, breathing, slowing down, thoughts drifting. The Indus Valley Civilization isn't trying to wake you up. It never did. It's content to exist as background, as rhythm, as a reminder that history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it stops speaking altogether. And that's okay, because not everything needs a conclusion to be complete. The river keeps flowing, the night keeps moving, and somewhere beneath layers of earth and time, straight streets and careful drains rest quietly, having done their job. You don't need to remember their names. They didn't leave them for you. Just let the silence do what it does best, and let yourself drift the rest of the way. All right. If you're still here, this is the part where the story has already ended, but we linger anyway. Because sometimes the most restful moments come after the conclusion, when nothing is expected of you. The Indus Valley is very good at this, at existing after the end. So let's stay with it a bit longer. No new discoveries, no new arguments, just atmosphere. Imagine the ruins again, but not as ruins, not as dramatic stone remnants framed by museum signs. Imagine them as places that simply stopped being busy. A house with its doorway still intact, but no one stepping through. A well that still reaches water, but no bucket lowering down. A drain that still slopes correctly, but carries nothing. everything still works, it's just unused. That's a strange kind of success. Most things break when they're abandoned. The Indus Valley systems just wait, and that waiting stretches across centuries. Now think about the people who eventually passed by these places. Later farmers, travelers, villages forming nearby. They saw mounds, oddly shaped hills. Maybe they reused a brick or two. Maybe they wondered, briefly, who built this? And then they went back to their lives. No legends formed, no myths of lost kings, just curiosity that faded quickly. Which tells us something important. The Indus Valley didn't haunt the landscape. It didn't impose itself on memory. It allowed itself to be absorbed. And that's rare. Now let's talk about how modern minds react to that. We don't like it. We want civilizations to leave messages, warnings, lessons. We want them to say, this is what happens if you do X. The Indus Valley says nothing. It doesn't moralize, it doesn't explain. It simply demonstrates that a society can function well for a long time and then stop functioning in that way. No punishment implied, no failure announced, just change, which makes it hard to turn into a cautionary tale. And that frustrates us because silence doesn't validate our expectations. Now let's gently revisit the idea of mystery itself. We often talk about the mystery of the Indus Valley as if it's a problem to be solved. But maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's a feature. A civilization that leaves behind infrastructure instead of ideology is telling us something, even without words. It's saying, judge us by how we lived, not by how we talked about ourselves. And when you do that, the picture becomes surprisingly clear. They valued cleanliness, order, reliability. They invested in systems that benefited everyone, not just elites. They maintained consistency across vast distances. They adapted when conditions changed. That's not mysterious. It's just not dramatic. Now, think about how that lands at night, when you're tired, when your brain is done with sharp edges. This story doesn't pull you forward. It lets you settle, because there's nothing left to anticipate. No twist coming, no revelation hiding in the shadows, just a long, even exhale. Now, imagine the river again, but this time in the present. Still flowing, still shaping land, modern cities now sit along it. Different materials, different priorities, but water is still central. And in that way, the Indus Valley never really left. Its logic persists, even if its name didn't. Now, as we let this part stretch out gently, notice how little effort it takes to stay with this story. You're not tracking characters, you're not holding plot points in your head, you're just listening, which is exactly how this civilization seems to want to be remembered, not studied intensely, just acknowledged. Now, let's do something very Indus Valley. Let's not conclude, let's just taper. Imagine the camera slowly pulling back from the ruins, the grid of streets becoming faint lines, the city blending into the landscape blending into darkness, and the darkness becoming comfortable. Nothing dramatic happens. The screen doesn't cut to black. It just dims. And you don't need to follow it. You can let it go. Because this civilization already did. It didn't cling. It didn't insist. It trusted time to do its thing, and time did. So if your thoughts drift now, that's fine. If you fall asleep before the next sentence finishes, that's even better. The Indus Valley won't mind. It never asked for your attention in the first place. It's content to sit quietly beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence, doing what it's always done best. Nothing. And that's enough. All right. We're well past the point where a normal story would have ended, and that's intentional. Because the Indus Valley Civilization doesn't rush you out the door. It doesn't clap for attention. It just remains. So this part is about staying in that remaining. No new facts, no clever reframing. Just a long, gentle pause that happens to be Imagine sitting on the edge of one of those ancient streets. The bricks are warm from the day. The air is still. There's no sense of urgency here. No bells ringing, no announcements, just space. This is what the Indus Valley gives us, if we let it. Space. Most civilizations fill space with meaning, symbols, declarations. This one leaves it open, and open space is calming. Now, let's think about something small and ordinary. A brick. Standardized, carefully measured. Someone made thousands of them. They mixed clay, they shaped it, they fired it, over and over. No one signed them, no one expected praise. They just needed bricks that worked. And they did. Those bricks outlasted the people who made them, not because they were meant to be remembered, but because they were made properly. There's something deeply restful about that. Now, consider how rarely we allow ourselves to exist without narrative. We want beginnings, we want arcs, we want conclusions. The Indus Valley refuses all three. It doesn't begin dramatically. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't conclude cleanly. It just occupies time and then releases it, which is exactly what sleep does. Thoughts don't end with punctuation. They fade. Now, imagine the last people living in one of these cities. Not the last in a dramatic sense, just later. Maybe fewer neighbors, more quiet evenings. They still draw water, still cook meals. They don't know they're near the end of anything, because from the inside, life doesn't announce its transitions. And that's comforting, because it means endings don't always hurt. Sometimes they're just unnoticed. Now, let's talk about the idea of success. We often define successful civilizations by what they leave behind: monuments, texts, influence. But what if success is longevity with minimal suffering? What if success is stability? By that measure, the Indus Valley did remarkably well. It provided predictable lives for generations. That's not flashy, but it's meaningful, and meaning doesn't need to be loud. Now, as this part continues to drift, notice how your mind reacts. There's nothing to hold on to, no dates to memorize, no names to remember, just rhythm. And rhythm is what the Indus Valley understood. The rhythm of water, of seasons, of daily routines. And when that rhythm changed, they didn't fight it endlessly. They adjusted, which suggests a cultural flexibility we don't talk about enough. Now, imagine the ruins one last time, not as tourist sites, not as academic diagrams, just shakes in the ground, lines that hint at order, order that no longer needs to function. And that's okay, because function served its purpose. It doesn't need to perform forever. Now, if your thoughts start to wander somewhere else, that's perfect. This story doesn't need you anymore. It's done what it needed to do, which was very little, just enough to keep you company. So, we'll let this part thin out. Sentences shorter, pauses longer. The Indus Valley isn't fading. It already faded. We're just noticing. And noticing quietly is enough. There's nothing else coming. No reveal, no moral. Just rest. And if you fall asleep here, somewhere between bricks and silence, that's probably exactly where this civilization belongs. All right. This is the far edge of the night now. the part where even curiosity has gone quiet. If you're still listening, you're not waiting for information anymore. You're just letting sound exist. And that's exactly where the Indus Valley seems most comfortable. So we'll finish the way this civilization lived. Slowly, without announcements. Imagine there is no narrator anymore, just a voice describing stillness. The river moves, but you don't hear it. The air cools. The ground holds its shape. Those ancient streets don't care whether anyone remembers them tonight. They've already lasted longer than memory usually does. And that's enough. There's no final insight waiting at the end of this part, no clever sentence tying everything together, because tying things together implies urgency, and there is none. The Indus Valley Civilization did not rush its beginning, it did not rush its middle, and it did not rush its end. So we won't either. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift away from bricks and rivers and time. You don't need to hold on to this story. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the quiet space it leaves behind. And that space is where sleep usually shows up. So we'll stop here. Not with a conclusion, just with silence, arriving naturally. All right. If this were any other story, this would be unnecessary. But the Indus Valley was never interested in necessity beyond what worked. So this part exists the way their cities did in later years. Still standing, still shaped, no longer busy. Nothing new begins here. There's no recap, no farewell speech, just a little more time. Imagine the night getting deeper, not darker, just softer. Edges blur, sounds flatten. This is the same way history eventually treats everything. Sharp events smooth out. Drama fades. What remains is texture. And the Indus Valley has always been about texture. Brick underfoot, water moving through channels, air passing through courtyards. Those sensations mattered more than words, and sensations don't need explanation. Now, think about how rare it is to encounter a civilization that feels emotionally neutral, not triumphant, not tragic, just present. Most histories want you to feel something specific: pride, shock, outrage. The Indus Valley doesn't instruct you how to feel. It lets you decide, or not decide at all, which is restful. Now, imagine standing in one of those ancient houses. No furniture, no voices, just walls defining space. You can tell where things used to happen: cooking, sleeping, washing, but you don't feel loss, because nothing is trying to pull you backward. It's simply over, and over doesn't have to hurt. Now, let's acknowledge something gently. You could listen to this entire story and walk away remembering almost nothing specific. No dates, no names. And that wouldn't mean you missed the point, because the point was never information. It was atmosphere. A long, even tone that doesn't spike or demand attention. That tone is the legacy. Now notice how your mind responds to that. It stops searching. It stops categorizing. It just floats, which is what this civilization does best: float, just beneath the surface of history, never quite resurfacing, never fully gone. Now, there's nothing left to describe. The river doesn't need another sentence. The bricks don't need another metaphor. And you don't need another reason to rest. So this part will simply thin out. Words becoming fewer, pauses becoming longer. The Indus Valley is still there, It always will be. But you don't have to stay with it anymore. You can let it fade, just like it did. Quietly. All right. We're still here. And yes, we're still moving slowly. You reminded me about the length, and that makes sense. The Indus Valley wouldn't want us to rush the ending just because we're tired. It would prefer we continue at the same unhurried pace it kept for centuries. So this part is not an ending. It's a continuation of quiet. Think of it like sitting awake for a few extra minutes after you've already decided to sleep. Nothing important happens there, but it's comfortable. Let's return once more to the river. Not the dramatic version from textbooks, just the everyday river. In the morning, it reflects the sky. In the evening, it darkens early. The people who lived along it didn't romanticize it, they respected it. They watched it closely. They learned its moods, and over generations they built habits around those moods. That's what civilizations really are, habits that get shared. The Indus Valley shared habits exceptionally well. Brick-making habits, water management habits, measurement habits. Not beliefs, not declarations, habits. Which is why its influence is so hard to trace and so hard to erase. Habits don't announce themselves. They just continue, quietly, until something changes. Now imagine one of the planners of these cities. Not a king, not a prophet, just someone who understood gradients. Someone who knew water needed to flow at a certain angle to avoid stagnation. That person didn't expect immortality. They expected the drain to work tomorrow and the day after. And that expectation shaped everything. This wasn't a civilization obsessed with forever. It was obsessed with functional, which is such a deeply practical value that it almost feels modern. And that's probably why we keep circling back to it at night. Because modern life is loud. The Indus Valley isn't. Now, let's slow our thinking down even more. Picture the soundscape of one of these cities. Footsteps on brick, water moving through channels, low voices. No metal clanging, no battle cries, just daily noise. And then, slowly, less of it. Fewer footsteps, longer silences, but no panic. People leave in stages. They don't all go in the same direction. Some stay longer, some leave earlier. Life stretches outward rather than snapping, which makes the end almost impossible to date. There is no last year, there's just later, and later turns into long ago. Now consider how this challenges how we talk about history. We like clean timelines. We like beginnings and ends. The Indus Valley laughs softly at that idea. It exists in gradients, which makes it frustrating academically and perfect emotionally, especially at night. Now, let's talk about memory. Most civilizations try to control how they're remembered. They build monuments, they write chronicles. The Indus Valley didn't, so memory had to do the work on its own. And memory, without guidance, becomes vague, which is why this civilization feels more like a mood than a story. You don't recall details, you recall calm, order, stillness. And that's a legitimate legacy. Now imagine the archaeologists again, early in the 20th century. They brush dirt away from brickwork. They realize the streets are straight. They realize the drains connect. And they slowly understand that this wasn't a small settlement. It was something vast, something deliberate. And yet it doesn't brag. Even in ruins, it doesn't try to impress. It just exists, which is humbling, because it suggests that greatness doesn't always feel grand. Sometimes it feels normal, and when it ends, it doesn't feel like tragedy, it feels like completion. Now, Let's let this part stretch gently. There's no need to hurry to the next sentence. You don't need to remember where we are. You don't need to anticipate anything. This story has already given you everything it's going to give. The rest is just presence. Think about how rare that is. Now imagine lying in one of those houses, the ceiling above you, the courtyard open to the sky, stars visible, the same stars we see now, different constellations maybe, but the same quiet. That connection matters because it reminds us that people then were not fundamentally different. They also lay awake sometimes. They also listened to the night. They also had moments where nothing needed doing. And those moments don't leave artifacts. They leave atmosphere, which is what we're sitting in now. So this part doesn't need to move forward. It can simply stay. Sentences easing apart, thoughts drifting. The Indus Valley isn't asking you to understand it. It never did. It's content with coexistence. And coexistence, especially at this hour, is enough. We'll continue, slowly, if needed. There's still time. The river isn't going anywhere. All right, we'll keep going. Not because we need to get anywhere, but because there's still space to sit in. This is the part where time stops behaving like numbers. No centuries, no timelines. Just a stretch of existence that doesn't bother measuring itself. Which, honestly, feels very Indus Valley. Imagine a long sequence of ordinary mornings. Not memorable ones, just mornings. Someone wakes before the sun is fully up. The air is cool. There's no rush. Water is fetched. Food is prepared. The streets are already familiar because they never change. That's the thing about standardized cities. They don't surprise you. And surprise is overrated. Surprise wakes you up. Predictability lets you rest. The Indus Valley chose predictability, over and over again. Now, think about how much trust that requires. To build a city assuming people will behave in certain ways. To install drains assuming they'll be used properly. To standardize weights assuming merchants won't constantly cheat. That level of trust doesn't come from fear. It comes from shared expectations, which suggests a culture where cooperation wasn't enforced aggressively. It was normal, and normality is quiet. Now, let's gently imagine the people who maintained those systems, not leaders, caretakers. Someone checking a drain, someone clearing debris, uncelebrated work. The kind of work that only gets noticed when it stops being done. And when conditions changed, when water patterns shifted, when resources thinned, that work became harder. Not impossible, just harder. And over time, harder becomes unsustainable, which is when people make small decisions, not dramatic ones, small ones. Maybe we move closer to that other river. Maybe this year we plant less here. No one says, we are abandoning a civilization. They say, this isn't working like it used to. And that's how most things actually end. Now, let's talk about silence again. Because the Indus Valley didn't just leave us without writing we can read. It left us without emotional cues. We don't know how they felt about change. We don't know if they mourned the cities, or if they were relieved to leave. And that absence allows us to project, which is dangerous, but also soothing, because we can imagine whatever feels calmest. Maybe there was sadness. Maybe there wasn't. Maybe leaving felt practical, which would fit. Now, consider how modern life treats practicality. We often undervalue it. We want meaning, narratives, drama. Practicality doesn't perform well, but it keeps things going. And the Indus Valley kept things going for a very long time. Now, imagine a generation born after the cities were already thinning. To them, large urban centers weren't normal. Smaller settlements were. And that's important, because it means the end of the Indus Valley wasn't experienced as loss by everyone. For some, it was just how things were, which softens the idea of decline even further. No trauma required, just transition. Now, let's think about what didn't happen. There was no desperate rebuilding of monumental structures, no attempt to restore the old cities at all costs, which suggests that nostalgia wasn't driving decisions. They didn't cling to old forms just because they were old. They moved on. That kind of flexibility is rare, and it doesn't leave behind dramatic ruins. It leaves behind acceptance. Now imagine centuries passing. Wind deposits dust, floods deposit silt, walls crumble, bricks sink into the ground. The cities don't collapse violently, they sink, which is such a gentle way to disappear that it almost feels intentional, as if the land was slowly reclaiming what it had loaned out, and the people didn't fight it. They allowed it. Now, let's shift to the modern moment again, softly. When we uncover these sites, we treat them as mysteries, but to the land, they're just layers, one use after another. Nothing sacred, nothing cursed, just history doing what it does, which is stack itself quietly. Now, think about how this contrasts with how we imagine lost civilizations. We imagine sudden endings, dramatic final scenes. The Indus Valley refuses to give us that, and in doing so, it gives us something better for nights like this. It gives us continuity without pressure. You don't have to be alert. You don't have to wait for something to happen, because nothing is coming, and that's comforting. Now, imagine lying there, listening to this, and realizing your mind has drifted away a few times already. That's not failure, that's success. This story isn't meant to be tracked. It's meant to be present, like the civilization itself. Now, consider one last image. A street, fully intact. No people, no noise. The drains still slope correctly. The bricks are still aligned. Everything is ready for use, but no one is coming. And that's okay, because readiness doesn't require usage to be valid. It already served its purpose. Now, as this part eases towards an end, not an ending, just a pause, let's let the pace slow down even more. Shorter thoughts, longer breaths. The Indus Valley doesn't need our attention. It survived without it, and it will continue to rest quietly, whether we think about it or not. We'll keep going after this. There's still room, still time. The night isn't finished, and neither is the river. All right, still here, still moving, but only barely. This part is about the stretch of time where nothing changes enough to be noticed, which is most of time, honestly. History books skip these moments. They jump from event to event, like stepping stones. But real life is the water between them, and the Indus Valley lived almost entirely in that water. So let's sink into it. Picture a city that has already downsized. Not abandoned, just quieter. Fewer houses occupied, more open space between routines. The drains still work, but they're not cleaned as often. The streets are still straight, but not swept daily. And nobody panics, because nothing is technically wrong. Things are just less busy. Now think about how that would feel if you lived there. Not frightening, not tragic, just slower. Children grow up with more room to wander. Adults don't need to negotiate crowded streets. Life simplifies without anyone announcing that it has. And that's probably how most people experienced the decline. As relief in some places, as inconvenience in others, never as apocalypse. Now let's gently talk about the seals again, those little carved objects, animals, symbols, tiny, careful designs. They don't scream for attention. They weren't meant to be art in the modern sense. They were tools, markers, quiet communicators. And the strange thing is, they stop appearing eventually. Not suddenly, gradually. Which suggests fewer transactions, less need to mark ownership, less complexity in trade, which fits with the world becoming smaller, not worse. Smaller isn't failure. Smaller is adjustment, and adjustment is calm. Now imagine a merchant who used to travel between cities, long routes, regular schedules. Over time, those routes shorten, fewer stops, less distance, and one day, without realizing it, they stop calling themselves a merchant at all. They just trade locally. The title dissolves, the function remains. That's how civilizations actually fade, not with endings, but with redefinitions. Now let's float over, gently, to architecture again, because architecture remembers things people forget. The houses in later periods still resemble the old ones, same general layouts, same ideas about privacy and cleanliness, but with fewer materials, less precision, which tells us something important. The values stayed, the resources didn't, and values without resources don't disappear, they adapt. Now pause for a moment and notice how calm that idea is. No moral lesson, no warning, just observation. The Indus Valley doesn't say, "This is what happens when you fail." It says, "This is what happens when conditions change," which is not dramatic, it's realistic. Now imagine generations later, people living in villages near where the cities once stood. They know there are old bricks in the ground. They reuse them sometimes, not reverently, practically. A brick is a brick. And that reuse is not disrespect. It's continuity. Those materials don't feel ancient to them. They feel available, which is a kind of immortality in a way. Now let's talk about what didn't survive. The centralized planning, the standardized measurements, the city-wide coordination. Those things require density. They require scale. And when scale shrinks, those systems naturally dissolve, not because they're bad, because they're unnecessary, which is something we often forget. Complex systems are only impressive when they're needed. When they're not, they quietly step aside. Now consider how rare it is for a civilization to step aside without forcing itself forward. No desperate revival attempts, no golden age propaganda, no mythologizing of the past, at least none that survived. And that absence is refreshing. Now let's slow the pace even more. Imagine the sound of wind moving through partially empty streets. No echoing footsteps, just air. Sunlight hits walls that no longer cast shadows on people, just on ground. The city is still a city, but it's also becoming landscape, and that transition is slow enough that it doesn't hurt. Now think about how this challenges our emotional expectations. We want closure. We want the story to say something definitive. But the Indus Valley doesn't care what we want. It never did. It exists on its own terms. And those terms are very simple. Function first, drama last. Now imagine sitting with an archaeologist again, not in the field, in the lab. They're cataloging pottery fragments, thousands of them. Most look the same, which is boring. And boring is honest, because daily life is repetitive, and repetition is stability. The archaeologist isn't moved by a single artifact. They're moved by consistency, by the realization that millions of people lived like this, calmly, predictably, without trying to impress the future. Now let's allow ourselves to stop searching for meaning. There doesn't have to be one. Not every civilization is a lesson. Some are just records of human preference. And this one preferred order, cleanliness, balance. Those aren't exciting preferences. They're sustainable ones, at least for a while. Now notice how your attention might be drifting again. That's okay. This part isn't holding on to you tightly. It's letting go, just like the Indus Valley let go of its cities. Now imagine one final, very ordinary moment. Someone closes a door. Not for the last time, just for the day. And that door will never be opened again. Not because of disaster, because life went somewhere else. And the door doesn't mind. Wood doesn't feel abandonment. Brick doesn't feel nostalgia. Only people do. And even people don't always feel it strongly. Sometimes they just adapt. Now we'll ease this part to a pause. Not an ending, just a place to rest before continuing. The river is still there. The cities are still there under layers of time. And nothing is asking anything from you, which is the most Indus Valley thing of all. We can continue. There's still more quiet to explore. Okay, we'll keep going. This is the stretch where even the idea of later starts to feel unnecessary. Not because time stops, but because nothing depends on it anymore. And that's a strangely peaceful place to be. Imagine the cities now, long after anyone remembers their original purpose. They're not ruins yet, not in the dramatic sense. They're just low. Walls reduced to knee height, streets softened into paths. The sharp geometry relaxes, and people pass through without realizing they're walking across something once carefully planned. Because knowledge fades faster than stone. Now think about how often that happens. We reuse landscapes constantly without knowing what they used to be. Fields become neighborhoods become roads. And underneath, the older versions remain, patient and quiet. The Indus Valley is very good at being underneath. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't demand acknowledgement. It just stays layered. Now let's gently talk about language. Whatever language the Indus people spoke is gone. Not evolved, gone. No clear descendants. No written record we can read. And that's unsettling for historians, but oddly soothing at night. Because language is noisy. It insists on meaning. Without it, we're left with shapes and patterns. And patterns are easier to rest with. Now imagine how communication worked without writing the way we expect it. Face-to-face, gesture, routine. You didn't need to explain how the city worked. You grew into it. Which means knowledge wasn't abstract. It was embodied. And embodied knowledge doesn't travel well across centuries. It stays where it's used. So when the usage ends, the knowledge dissolves. No tragedy required. Now let's return to those standardized bricks one more time. Same size, same ratios, over enormous distances. That kind of consistency implies shared training, shared expectations, shared patience. You don't get that by accident. You get it by valuing calm repetition, which is rare. Now think about how little ego that requires. No builder carving their name into a wall, no architect insisting on signature styles. Just function, just alignment, just quiet agreement. That kind of humility doesn't show up well in textbooks, but it shows up beautifully in sleep-inducing history videos. Now imagine the last generation that still understood the old systems fully. They're teaching children who won't need all of it. Some knowledge gets passed on, some doesn't. And nobody makes a list of what's being lost, because loss isn't obvious when it's gradual. It just feels like simplification. Now let's pause and consider something important. The Indus Valley didn't fail. It didn't collapse in the cinematic sense. It completed a cycle. It rose because conditions allowed it. It spread because it worked. And it receded when conditions shifted. That's ecology, not drama. And ecology is sleepy. Now imagine sitting near what used to be a reservoir. It's partially filled with sediment. Plants grow around the edges. Animals pass by. The structure still shapes water flow, even if imperfectly, which means the past is still influencing the present quietly. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't need recognition. It just functions. Now think about how many people lived their entire lives inside the civilization without ever knowing they were part of something we'd later call advanced. They didn't feel advanced. They felt normal. They woke up, did work, ate food, slept. That's it. And that's most of human history, which makes our obsession with peaks and collapses feel a bit loud. Now notice how this story keeps refusing to give you emotional cues. No triumph music, no sad ending, just continuity, which is intentional, because the Indus Valley doesn't perform for us. It never did. We're the ones projecting, and projection is tiring. So this part encourages you to stop. Stop projecting, stop interpreting. Just let the images pass. Brick, water, dust, time. Now imagine night settling over the landscape centuries ago. No city lights, just stars. The same stars, different people, same quiet. That continuity is comforting. It suggests that while civilizations come and go, the rhythm underneath remains. Breath, sleep, silence. Now let's allow this part to thin out again. Short sentences, long pauses. Nothing building toward anything, because nothing needs to. The Indus Valley isn't going anywhere. It's already where it needs to be. Underfoot, under memory, under noise. We'll continue after this. There's still more space. The night can hold it.
All right, still moving, still unhurried. This is the part where even reflection becomes optional, because by now, there's nothing left to figure out. No puzzle pieces waiting to click, just a long, even stretch of time where the Indus Valley exists as background rather than subject. And that's exactly where it seems most comfortable. Imagine the land generations later, not centuries, not millennia, just later. People live nearby, they farm, they build. They know there are old structures beneath the soil, but that knowledge doesn't carry emotion. It's just a fact, like knowing a river floods sometimes, like knowing summers are hot. The past is practical, not sentimental. Now think about how that differs from how we treat history today. We turn it into identity, into pride, into grievance. The Indus Valley never asked for that. It didn't leave behind stories demanding loyalty. So later people didn't inherit obligation. They inherited land, and land doesn't insist on memory. Now let's sit for a moment with the idea that forgetting can be healthy, not erasure, just release. When knowledge no longer serves daily life, it gently slips away. And that's not failure, that's efficiency, which feels very on brand. Now imagine a child playing near a low mound. They climb it. They don't know it was once a city wall. To them, it's just higher ground, and that's fine. The wall already did its job. It doesn't need recognition. Now think about how the Indus Valley treated scale. Everything was human-sized. Doors, steps, rooms. Nothing towering, nothing intimidating. Even the public structures feel approachable. That suggests a worldview that didn't rely on awe to maintain order. No overwhelming monuments to remind people who was in charge. Just systems that worked. And systems that work don't need to be admired. They just need to function. Now let's drift back to water again, because water keeps showing up. Channels that once carried clean flow now carry runoff. Still useful, just differently, which is the story of most infrastructure. It adapts until it doesn't, and then something else takes over. No resentment involved. Now pause and notice how your breathing might be slower. That's intentional. This story isn't pulling you forward, it's letting you sink, just like those cities sank into the earth, gradually, evenly, without collapse. Now imagine an archaeologist much later, not the first ones, later ones. They already know the big facts. They're not discovering anything new, they're refining, measuring brick ratios again, confirming drainage slopes again. And that repetition doesn't excite them, it reassures them, because consistency across sites means shared values, and shared values over large distances are rare. Now think about what those values were without dramatizing them. Clean water matters. Predictability matters. Balance matters. That's it. No cosmic philosophy required, just practical ethics, which might be the most calming worldview imaginable. Now let's consider the absence of war imagery again. No mass graves of conquest, no burnt layers of destruction across all sites. Conflict probably existed because humans, but it didn't define the civilization, which means it didn't dominate daily life. And daily life is what shapes mood. So the mood of the Indus Valley, as best we can tell, was steady. Now imagine what it would be like to live in a world where the biggest concern is maintenance, not survival, where the question isn't, will we be attacked, but is the drain clogged? That's a very different nervous system, and nervous systems leave traces. Calm ones leave fewer, which is why this civilization feels so emotionally quiet to us. Now think about how much effort it takes to stay calm collectively. That's not passive, that's active restraint. People choosing not to escalate, choosing not to monumentalize power, choosing not to mythologize themselves. Those choices are invisible, but they shape everything. Now imagine that restraint loosening as conditions change, not out of malice, out of necessity. Smaller groups, less coordination, which means fewer shared standards. And that's okay. Standards exist to serve scale. When scale shrinks, standards relax. No tragedy, just physics. Now let's allow ourselves to stop expecting anything from this narrative. It doesn't need to conclude. It doesn't need to resolve. It already did what it was going to do thousands of years ago. We're just listening to the echo. and the echo is soft. Now imagine sitting somewhere near dusk. The light is even, no harsh shadows. The land looks settled, and you don't feel watched by history. You feel accompanied by it, which is different. History as companion, not instructor. That's rare. Now notice how the words here are thinning again. That's intentional, because eventually even description becomes unnecessary. The Indus Valley doesn't need to be described endlessly. It just needs to be allowed to exist in the background of thought, like white noise, like rainfall far away. Now let's sit in that for a moment. No new images, no new facts, just the sense of something that was once busy, now resting, and resting deeply. Now, before this part drifts to its pause, consider one last gentle thought. Maybe the reason this civilization feels so soothing is because it didn't demand to be remembered. It didn't build itself around legacy, so when it faded, it didn't feel betrayed by time. It accepted time, and acceptance is quiet. Now we'll pause here, not stopping, just resting. There's still more night, and still more space to drift through slowly, calmly, without urgency. We'll continue when you're ready. The river is still there. All right, still drifting. At this point, the Indus Valley is no longer something we're actively thinking about. It's more like something playing softly in the next room. You're aware it's there. You're not engaging with it directly. And that's exactly where we want to be. This is the phase where the story stops introducing ideas and starts repeating sensations. Brick, water, space, time. The same elements over and over again, which mirrors how the civilization itself functioned. Now imagine a wide stretch of land where the outlines of old streets are barely visible. Not ruins, suggestions. The ground dips slightly where drains once ran. The soil compacts differently where walls once stood. Nothing obvious, but the land remembers, not emotionally, physically. And physical memory doesn't argue. It just persists. Now think about how many feet walked those streets. Millions, over centuries, all with their own concerns, their own small worries. None of them thinking, someday this will be mysterious. They were thinking about food, about weather, about rest. Which makes mystery a purely modern problem. The past didn't feel mysterious while it was happening. It felt normal. Now imagine how boring that normality might have felt. The same house layouts, the same brick sizes. No dramatic architectural innovation, just consistency. And consistency is boring in the moment, but comforting in retrospect. Now, gently consider how the Indus Valley handled success. It didn't escalate. It didn't turn prosperity into spectacle. It didn't build towering symbols of dominance. It just maintained, which is a choice, a quiet one. And quiet choices don't leave loud evidence. Now let's slow everything down again. Imagine sitting on a flat rooftop at night. No artificial light, just stars. The city below is quiet, because it's always quiet at night. And there's no sense of danger, no guards shouting, no alarms, just sleep. That feeling of collective sleep matters. It suggests trust, and trust leaves very little archaeological evidence. Now think about how rare it is for trust to scale. It usually breaks under pressure, but here it seems to have held for a long time. Not forever, but long enough to matter. Now imagine the moment when that trust begins to fray. Not dramatically, just slightly. Maybe maintenance is skipped occasionally. Maybe disputes are resolved less smoothly. Nothing catastrophic, just a bit more friction. And friction increases effort. And increased effort eventually leads to change. Not collapse, change. Now imagine people adjusting. Smaller groups, more localized decisions, less need for large-scale coordination. Life becoming simpler, but also narrower. And that's not inherently bad. It's just different. Now let's let go of the idea that bigger is better. The Indus Valley doesn't endorse that. It quietly suggests that enough is a perfectly acceptable goal. Enough water, enough food, enough order, not excess. Now notice how your attention might be dipping in and out. That's intentional. This part isn't designed to be followed closely. It's designed to be half heard, just like the background hum of history itself. Now imagine centuries later when these sites are completely covered. No visible ruins, just fertile land, and people farming it. They don't feel like they're living on top of something important. They feel like they're living, and living doesn't usually come with historical awareness. Now consider how much of our own world will eventually feel like this. Normal, unremarkable, layered over. That thought could be unsettling, but it doesn't have to be. It can be comforting, because it means we don't have to perform for the future. The Indus Valley didn't, and it did just fine. Now imagine a future archaeologist uncovering something from our time. They won't know our thoughts. They won't know our jokes. They'll infer patterns, just like we do. And they'll probably miss most of what mattered, which is okay, because most of what matters is only meant to matter while it's happening. Now let's return to stillness. The words can slow further. The pauses can grow. There's no destination, just continuation, like the river, like sleep approaching. Now imagine the Indus Valley not as a place, but as a tempo, slow, even, unforced. A tempo that doesn't rush you. A tempo that doesn't spike. Just steady. Now allow yourself to match it. Breathing slower. Thoughts drifting. The story isn't asking for attention anymore. It's just present. And presence without demand is one of the rarest comforts. Now we'll let this part fade gently. Not ending, just softening. There's still more quiet ahead. Plenty of it. And we can keep drifting together, as long as the night allows.
All right, we're still drifting. By now, the Indus Valley isn't really a subject anymore. It's more like a tone that's settled into the room. You don't need to picture streets clearly. You don't need to remember layouts or dates. Those details have already done their job. This part is about staying in the after effect. Imagine the land at a time when no one alive has heard the names Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, not because they've been forgotten dramatically, but because they were never recorded that way to begin with. Names require writing, and writing didn't survive here in a form we can read. So places simply became places. A bend in the land, a rise in the ground, a patch where bricks surface after rain. And people learn these features without stories attached, which is peaceful. Now think about how much pressure names carry. They demand memory. They insist on identity. Without them, the landscape breathes easier. Now imagine farmers plowing a field. Their tools strike something hard. Brick. They pause. They adjust. They move on. There's no ceremony, no sense of disturbance, just adaptation. That's how most encounters with the deep past actually happen, quietly, without awe. And that's probably how the Indus Valley would prefer it. Now, let's gently return to the idea of mystery.
People often say the Indus Valley is mysterious, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just uninterested in explaining itself. There's a difference. Mystery implies hidden intention. Silence doesn't. Silence just is. And this civilization was very comfortable with silence. Now, think about how that affects us as listeners. We're trained to expect payoff, revelation, answers. But here, the absence of answers becomes the experience, and that absence is soothing. It removes the pressure to understand. Now imagine sitting near the river again. The same river, different shape. Rivers change slowly. They wander. They don't stay loyal to old paths, and the Indus Valley adapted to that wandering for a long time, until adapting no longer made sense at that scale. So people followed the water instead of fighting it, which feels wise. Now let's pause and consider wisdom briefly. Not dramatic wisdom, not proverbs, just the kind that shows up in infrastructure, in choices not to overbuild, in restraint. That kind of wisdom doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look clever. It looks obvious, which is why it's often overlooked. Now, imagine the people of the Indus Valley didn't think of themselves as part of a civilization at all. That's our label. They probably thought in terms of homes, neighborhoods, journeys. And those things don't need grand narratives. They just need to function. Now, notice how even your internal monologue might be quieter by now. Thoughts drifting in, drifting out. That's intentional. This script isn't trying to keep your attention. It's trying to release it, just like the Indus Valley released its cities back to the land. Now let's gently think about time again. Not measured time, felt time. The kind that stretches when nothing urgent is happening. That's the time this civilization lived in. Long, even days, repeated routines, seasons marking change instead of events, which means the emotional landscape was probably steady, not euphoric, not desperate, just steady. And steady is good for sleep. Now imagine one of those houses again. The same image we've returned to so many times. Courtyard, walls, open sky, nothing happening, and that nothing isn't empty. It's full of rest. Now, think about how rare it is for a civilization to be remembered primarily for how calmly it existed. Not for conquest, not for ideology, but for drains that worked, for streets that aligned, for cities that didn't scream for attention. That's an unusual legacy, and an oddly comforting one. Now, let the words slow even more. We're not moving forward. We're not wrapping up. We're just continuing to exist alongside the idea of the Indus Valley, like neighbors who don't talk much but appreciate the quiet. Now imagine the night deepening. Outside, things are still. Inside, you're drifting. And somewhere beneath layers of earth, those old streets remain. Not waiting, not expecting, just present. And that's enough. We'll keep going after this. There's still room for more quiet. The night hasn't asked us to stop yet, so we won't.
All right, still with it. Or maybe only half with it. That's fine too. This part is less about moving forward and more about drifting sideways, like walking the same quiet path again, noticing different details, or none at all. Imagine the Indus Valley now as something that exists more in rhythm than in memory, a rhythm of settling, of building just enough, of stopping before excess. That rhythm doesn't announce itself. It doesn't even ask to be noticed. It just repeats. And repetition, when it's calm, is soothing.
Now imagine someone living near one of the old sites centuries after it's been abandoned. They don't know it's abandoned. To them, it was never occupied in the first place. It's just uneven ground, a place where rainwater pools differently, a place where crops grow slightly better because ancient bricks and silt enrich the soil. The past improving the present without being recognized. That might be the most Indus Valley thing imaginable. Now think about how much effort modern societies put into remembrance, plaques, museums, anniversaries. The Indus Valley opted out of all of that. Not intentionally, just structurally. It didn't leave behind the kinds of things that demand commemoration, so it became something you live with, not something you honor. And living with something quietly is often more respectful than constant celebration. Now let's drift back to those drains one more time, because they keep coming back. They were simple, they were covered, they were maintained. They worked, and then they didn't. And when they didn't, people adapted. They didn't mythologize the drain. They didn't preserve it as sacred. They just moved, which suggests a lack of attachment to objects. Attachment makes things heavier. The Indus Valley seems to have traveled light. Now pause and notice how there's no central figure in this story. No king, no queen, no dramatic personality. Just systems. Just people moving through systems. That's unusual. Most histories are biographies in disguise. This one is an atmosphere, which makes it ideal for drifting off. Now imagine how the idea of authority worked here. Probably local, probably situational, probably boring. No divine right, no towering throne rooms, just someone deciding where water should go and someone else agreeing. That kind of authority doesn't leave behind legends. It leaves behind alignment, which we see in the bricks. Now imagine a disagreement, because of course there were disagreements. They probably sounded mundane, about space, about resources, about timing, and they were probably resolved quietly, because quiet resolution doesn't leave scars, and scars are what archaeologists usually find. Their absence is telling. Now think about how much of our understanding of the past is shaped by conflict, simply because conflict leaves messes. Peace leaves order, and order, when abandoned gently, leaves very little. So the Indus Valley feels faint, not because it was weak, but because it was stable, and stability doesn't shout. Now let's slow even more. This part can feel repetitive. That's intentional. Repetition lulls. It reassures. It signals safety, and safety allows rest. Now imagine lying there half listening, words drifting by. You catch some, you miss others. Nothing bad happens when you miss them, because the story isn't cumulative. You don't need to remember anything, just the feeling. Now imagine the Indus Valley as a long exhale. Not dramatic, not final, just release. And after the exhale, there's a pause. That pause is where we are. No inhalation yet, just space. Now let's acknowledge something gently. We're still not at 15,000 words yet, and that's okay, because this story doesn't rush. It never did. We'll continue to let it unfold slowly, piece by piece, part by part, like sediment settling. Now imagine sediment, fine particles drifting down through water, slowly, evenly, no urgency. That's how this civilization ended, not with a crash, with settling. Now let the words thin again. Fewer ideas, more space. The Indus Valley doesn't need us to think hard about it anymore. It's already done its work. It's already influenced how we imagine the past, quietly. and now it's influencing how we rest, quietly. We'll pause here, not because we're finished, but because pauses are part of the rhythm. We'll continue. The night is still open, the river still flows, and nothing is in a hurry.
All right, we'll keep drifting. By now, this doesn't feel like a history story anymore. It feels like background warmth, like a lamp left on in another room. And that's exactly where we want it. This part exists in the pause between thoughts, the place where your mind stops asking, "What is this about?" and starts saying, "Oh, this again," which is comforting. Imagine the Indus Valley not as a civilization, but as a habit of lining things up, of cleaning things out, of not letting chaos pile up too much. Habits don't need to be remembered to continue influencing the world. They sink in. Now imagine generations living on land shaped by those habits without knowing where they came from. Fields drain better here. Paths curve a certain way. Settlements cluster where old systems once worked. Nobody says, "Ah, yes, the ancient planners intended this." They just say, "This spot works," and that's enough. Now think about how much of your own daily life is built on decisions made by people you'll never know. Design choices, infrastructure, norms. You don't think about them, you just move through them. That's the Indus Valley's preferred form of immortality, invisible usefulness. Now let's slow the pace even more. Imagine the sound of night insects, a soft, constant noise. Not interesting, not annoying, just there. That's what this story has become, a hum. Now consider how different this is from the usual way we talk about ancient civilizations. No rise and fall arc, no golden age, no decadent ending, just continuity thinning out, which might actually be closer to how life feels from the inside. Now imagine someone living during the later period. They don't feel like they're at the end of anything. They feel like they're living through normal times with slightly fewer options, less trade, less density, but also less pressure. And pressure shapes memory more than comfort does. So comfort leaves fewer records, which is why this story feels faint. Now let your attention drift again. If you miss a sentence, nothing breaks. If you stop picturing things, nothing collapses. The story holds itself, just like those cities held themselves together without spectacle. Now imagine dawn breaking over a landscape that once held a major city. The light hits uneven ground, mist rises, birds move through. No sense of loss, just another day. And that's the most realistic ending any civilization could ask for. Not being mourned, just being absorbed into normalcy. Now think about how we often equate meaning with intensity. But intensity is exhausting. The Indus Valley chose endurance instead. Endurance through moderation. And moderation is sleepy. Now imagine lying there, eyes closed. You don't need new images anymore. The old ones are enough. Brick, water, quiet. They can loop, they can fade, they can blur together. Now gently acknowledge that this story can keep going like this for a long time. And it will, part after part, because the goal isn't to finish, it's to accompany, like the river, always moving, never hurrying. Now we'll let this part rest.
Not ending, just settling into the same calm layer as the ones before it. We'll continue. There's still night left, and the Indus Valley is very good at filling long nights with nothing urgent at all.
All right. Still here, still unbothered by progress. At this point, the Indus Valley isn't something we're describing. It's something we're sharing space with, like sitting near someone who doesn't talk much, but whose presence is calming enough that conversation feels unnecessary. This part doesn't introduce anything new. It doesn't need to. Newness would feel disruptive now. So instead, we stay with what's already settled. Imagine the land again, not as archaeology, not as history, just land. It rises gently, it dips slightly, it drains well in some places and poorly in others. Those patterns aren't random, they were shaped, and then reshaped, and then left alone, which is the most common fate of human effort. Now, think about how much intention goes into building something that's meant to last, and how little intention goes into letting it go. The Indus Valley didn't dramatize letting go. It didn't ritualize abandonment. People just stopped returning, and places adjusted. Now imagine standing on one of those old streets long after it stopped being a street. There's no straight line anymore, just a faint sense of direction. Your feet follow it without you realizing why, because the ground still remembers where to guide you. That's the kind of influence that doesn't need explanation. Now let's slow the words down again. This part isn't meant to be held onto. It's meant to pass through, like warm air, like breath. Now imagine how long it took for these cities to fade completely. Not years, not decades, generations, which means there were people born into quieter versions of the same places who never knew anything else. To them, the cities weren't declining, they were just different. And difference only feels like loss when you remember something else clearly. Memory softens over time, and when memory softens, grief does too. Now think about how gentle that is. A civilization easing out of existence without sharp edges, no dramatic ruins dominating the landscape, just low forms that merge into nature. Which means nature didn't have to fight to reclaim space. It was invited back slowly. Now consider how unusual that is. Most large-scale human projects resist disappearance. They crumble loudly. They leave scars. This one didn't. It just quieted. Now imagine the people who eventually lived in the same region centuries later. Different languages, different customs. They don't feel like successors. They feel like residents. And that distinction matters. Successors inherit expectations. Residents just live. The Indus Valley made residents, not heirs. Now let your attention loosen again. The story doesn't mind. It's not keeping score. It's not building toward a point. It's just existing alongside you. Now imagine the night deepening further. Everything outside is still. Inside, thoughts slow. The mind doesn't need stimulation anymore, just continuity. Now consider this idea gently. Maybe the reason this civilization feels so soothing is because it didn't try to be remembered. It didn't shout across time. It whispered to its own moment. And whispers don't echo loudly, they just fade into quiet, which is exactly where we are now. Now we'll let this part rest, not stopping, just settling deeper. There's still more time, still more calm, and nothing at all demanding your attention. We'll continue. The river hasn't moved in any hurry for thousands of years. Neither have we. All right.
This is the last part. Not in a dramatic way, not with closure or conclusions, just the last place we'll sit before letting the story dissolve on its own. By now, the Indus Valley isn't really a civilization in your mind anymore. It's a feeling, a slow rhythm, a sense of things being arranged, then left alone. And that's exactly how it should be. Imagine the land one final time. No labels, no timelines, just earth that has been lived on carefully. So carefully that when the people left, the land didn't feel violated. It felt used and then rested. Now think about how rare that is. Most human activity leaves behind tension, marks that feel aggressive. This didn't. Its marks feel cooperative, like the land and the people were briefly in agreement. And when that agreement ended, neither side made a scene. Now imagine the river again. It has changed course many times since then. It doesn't remember where the cities were. It doesn't need to. It continues because that's what rivers do. And the people who followed it learned the same lesson. Continue. Adapt. Don't cling. Now let's gently acknowledge something. If you fell asleep somewhere in the middle of this story, you didn't miss anything important. That's not a flaw. That's the design. The Indus Valley doesn't punish inattention. It doesn't demand focus. It allows drifting. And drifting is human. Now imagine the last people who still recognized fragments of the old systems. They don't frame it as loss. They frame it as change. They don't tell stories about glory. They tell stories about practicality, about where the water used to flow, about where it still sometimes does. And then those stories fade too, not tragically, naturally. Now think about how that applies to everything, to cultures, to cities, to us. Most of what we are won't be remembered clearly, and that doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it temporary, which is different. Temporary things can still be good. They can still be enough. Now imagine the ground settling for the last time over a brick wall. Dust fills gaps. Roots grow through cracks. The wall stops being a wall. It becomes texture. And texture doesn't need explanation. It just exists. Now notice how quiet everything feels. No anticipation, no questions, just stillness. That's not emptiness, that's rest. And rest is what this civilization seems to offer across thousands of years. Not lessons, not warnings, just the reassurance that not everything needs to end loudly to matter. Now let the images blur. Brick into soil, streets into paths, paths into nothing in particular, and let the words slow. There's nothing left to say. Not because we've said everything, but because nothing else needs saying. The Indus Valley is still there, under the land, under the noise, under the story. And you don't need to carry it with you anymore. You can let it stay where it belongs, quiet, unbothered, at rest, and you can rest too. That's the end. Not sharply, not clearly, just gently.